Does the match love the wick? Does the wick love the wax or the air it consumes? Yes, without question. To melt together, to burn together, to change together, the pieces of the candle must love each other, though not necessarily wisely and not necessarily well.
While labels can be helpful, there is often pressure placed on people to choose them and a need to have chosen correctly. We all belong somewhere on a spectrum, both for sexual orientation and gender identity. Some people may not understand that sexual orientation and gender identity are on a spectrum, and they feel pressure to be as precise as possible about how they identify and label themselves. If they aren't fitting into their label 100% of the time, a fear begins to brew that maybe this was all a mistake. Maybe they came out as the wrong identity. But is there a wrong identity? You get to say who you are, how you identify, or if you don't want to label at all. We all belong somewhere on a spectrum. We all belong somewhere. We begin our service with these words by Isabella Gonzalez, published in an online article for the adolescent sexual health magazine, Sex, Etc. Perhaps no issue within the LGBTQ communities surpasses the airtime given to the words we use to describe ourselves and each other. So many things are contained in these words: self-expression, self-determination, who belongs in the group, who doesn't, who's most and least oppressed, and how we can tell. We use words to find and connect ourselves to one another through shared identities and experiences. And sometimes these words divide us intentionally or not. While this looks a certain way in LGBTQ communities, the sentiment, how wide or narrow we draw our circles, transcends communities and experiences of life. These are important considerations, especially in communities who are pushed to the margins of public society, or those who fail to see themselves in prevailing media, culture, or political organization. I want to invite you this morning to explore the role identity plays in LGBTQ communities and what this can tell all of us about being in community together across differences and similarities. Whether you are trans or cis, queer or straight, may you find something meaningful here. Good morning and welcome to this service of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. My name is Birch Spick. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. This is a service that's part of the Queer Your Faith project of IUON, the Iowa Unitarian Universalist Witness and Advocacy Network. To those of you joining us because of this, we give you a special welcome this morning. As we begin this service, let's stop to acknowledge the Indigenous land we occupy, no matter where, how we gather. The building of this congregation stands in the traditional homeland of the Bajoje people, known also as the Iowa. It is also the homeland of the Meskwaki and Sauk peoples. When you hear a land acknowledgement, consider giving to an Indigenous cause, organization, or mutual aid project. Thank you for joining us here this morning.
Good morning. My name is Louise Alcorn. My pronouns, for now, are she, her, and hers. And I am the celebrant for this morning's service. Whether you're here for the hour, for a lifetime, or somewhere in between, thank you for joining us in this community that grows ethically and spiritually, serves justly, and loves radically. This service is being recorded and will be available to view later on the church's website and our YouTube page. If you're joining us by Zoom, feel free to keep your cameras on, but please keep your mics muted in consideration of one another. If you are joining us in person, children and families of all ages are welcome to stay for the whole service. In the back of the auditorium is our We Worship space, which families may use if their children or their parents need to move about a little bit during the service. Our gathering song is number 300, With a Heart and Mind. If you are joining by Zoom, please keep your mics muted. You will find the words on the screen.
Each week, we celebrate that this community is an intergenerational one. We celebrate that no matter how old or young we are, we all have something to learn and grow in together. When I was the age of maybe the age that some of you are, my parents had this book called It's So Amazing. It talked about people's relationships with each other and how they make families together. And at one point in the book, it talked about how some men like men, and we call them gay, and some women like women, and we call them lesbians. As an 11-year-old, this was the first time I had a word for how I felt about myself and other people. And reading about it so lovingly and gently meant a lot to me. We'll spend a lot of time in this service talking about the words we use to describe ourselves and each other and how we feel. You may hear words like lesbian or bisexual or transgender, and some of these words may be new to you, or maybe some of them aren't. You may know people who are lesbian or transgender or bisexual yourself. And the more people you meet, the more people you listen to, you may find that not everyone agrees on what these words mean. You may hear some bisexual people say they love men and women. You may hear others say that they love people no matter what gender they are. You may meet some transgender people who say they've never been the gender that people thought they were when they were babies. And you may meet some transgender people who say they used to be one gender but aren't anymore. And this can be confusing. It can be really confusing when you hear people disagree about what these words mean for them and who can use them to describe their experiences. So here are two things I want you to think about if this seems confusing to you. The first is listen to what they have to say about themselves. Listen to the stories they have to tell you and why these words are important to them. And look at the way that people who use the same words are the same. Look at what makes them similar. Look at what connects them to each other. That's what's important. What is important is how we're connected to each other, no matter how alike or not alike we seem. It can be easy to pay attention to how we're different or how some people don't fit in with one another. But what matters more, what will help solve some of our confusion, is looking for how people are alike and how they're connected to one another. What are the things that they love? What are the things that make them happy or feel safe? No matter what words we use to describe ourselves, you might find that we share more of these things in common than you thought. Thank you for listening to these words of mine. We make our journey together in this community of meaning, fostering one another's growth through services, classes, and fellowship. So many of us pour our time and talent into our life together, and this life together is possible also through financial giving. Our pledges and donations support the work of this congregation in nourishing our lives, and our Sunday donations support the work of nurturing our values. So in this offering, let us be grateful for all that we have and all that we can give. Half of our offering we give today goes to our congregation's social justice work, and half will be split with our faith and action partners, Knock and Drop and Just Voices, to support their work in our communities. For those of you on Zoom, we encourage you to use the church's giving page on the website or mobile app. You will also see the link posted in the chat. We have a slight change from what we said earlier this morning. So I want to thank all of the families now who have brought their children to this service. We'll sing them out now to join our children's programming. In the middle of this hour, in the middle of our lives, we make time for stillness. Let's enter into a time of meditation, thought, or prayer. To begin, set your body comfortably, stably. Rest your hands in your lap, at your sides, or however you can rest them without straining. Straighten your back as much as you can. Close your eyes if that helps you find your center. Now clench your muscles. Start with your fingers and toes, then your arms and legs, your shoulders, your neck, your jaw, and now relax. Clench your muscles again, and relax. Breathe in, slowly, deep, down into your belly. Breathe out, slowly. Breathe in, breathe out again. Deep and steady. We will meditate for 1 minute. In this congregation made distant by space but connected by care for one another, we gather each Sunday to tend to one another's joys and concerns. Here in this space, we lift the names of those people we hold in our minds and hearts, aloud or silently. If you are joining us by Zoom, carrying someone in joy or concern this morning, you may share that in the chat box. We have some joys and sorrows to share this week. And Maori and Al Powers write, their daughter has died at her home in Virginia Beach from cancer. Al flew out to see her. He got a smile of recognition from her, and he was able to talk to her even though she wasn't conscious. They are glad that she is out of her suffering, but are saddened that her life was cut short at 48. There will be no service. Her cremains will be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. She served as a machinist on a submarine tender for the Navy in the Mediterranean right out of high school. Anne and Al are deeply grateful for the support, love, and care everyone has shown them during this time. Karen Lauer writes that Michael and Sarah are flying back to Maryland for another series of MRIs and an appointment with the neurosurgeon. Sarah has had continuing debilitating headache pain and grinding sounds and feelings in her neck after her surgery. Karen asks that we keep them, and especially Sarah, in our thoughts as they continue to seek diagnosis and an answer for Sarah's pain. Linda Lovell shares a joy, the birth of her granddaughter. Her son Peter and his wife Diane Siasoko, who is also a member of this congregation, gave birth to June Siasoko Lovell on January 26th. Linda writes that all are doing well, and of course, baby June is a precious, adorable bundle of joy. Addresses and phone numbers for anyone whose joy or sorrow we have shared can be found in the member directory or by contacting the Pastoral Care Committee. Let our hearts be with all those near and far, with people the world over who are in need of care and who care for their communities. For the people who work to meet the needs of the people in their lives, for those who continue to confront injustice, for frontline workers in healthcare and service industries, for families and communities grieving the loss of loved ones. May we bear witness to atrocities that flash before our eyes in quick succession. May we bear witness to the struggles to overcome which we have yet to see. In the tradition of our congregation, we light 3 candles, one for the joys and concerns we have shared, one for the names we have raised up, and one for all that remains unspoken but present here in our hearts. Gathered here together, we take a moment to honor these joys and sorrows.
Our first reading comes from the introduction to the summer 1991 edition of the magazine Anything That Moves, published by the Bay Area Bisexual Network from 1991 through 2001. Notice that the multitude of experiences united by 2 things, an identity word that speaks to similar experiences, and the conviction to push back against misconceptions, a recognition that people are stronger through celebrating their commonalities, even when their experiences aren't all identical. From the magazine. Our choice to use Anything That Moves as the title for the magazine has been nothing less than controversial. That we would choose to redefine the stereotype that, quote, bisexuals will anything that moves to suit our own purposes has created myriad reactions. Those critical of the title feel we are purporting the stereotype and damaging our image. Those in favor of its use see it as a movement away from the stereotype toward bisexual empowerment. We deliberately chose the radical approach. We are creating dialogue through controversy. We are challenging people to face their own external and internal biphobia. We are demanding attention and are redefining anything that moves on our own terms. Read our lips. We will write or print or say anything that moves us beyond the limiting stereotypes that are displaced onto us. This magazine was created by bisexuals. It is published by the Bay Area Bisexual Network and reflects the integrity and inclusive nature of the BABN Statement of Purpose. Anything That Moves was created out of pride, out of necessity, out of anger. We are tired of being analyzed, defined, and represented by people other than ourselves. Or worse yet, not considered at all. We are frustrated by the imposed isolation and invisibility that comes from being told or expected to choose either a homosexual or heterosexual identity. Monosexuality is a heterosexist dictate used to oppress homosexuals and to negate the validity of bisexuality. Bisexuality is a whole, fluid identity. Do not assume that bisexuality is binary or duogamous in nature, that we have two sides, or that we must be involved simultaneously with both genders to be fulfilled. In fact, don't assume that there are only two genders. Do not mistake our fluidity for confusion, irresponsibility, or an inability to commit. Do not equate promiscuity, infidelity, or unsafe sexual behavior with bisexuality. Those are human traits that cross all sexual orientations. Nothing should be assumed about anyone's sexuality, including your own. We are angered by those who refuse to accept our existence, our issues, our contributions, our alliances, our voice. It is time for the bisexual voice to be heard. Do not expect each magazine to be representative of all bisexuals, for our diversity is too vast. Do not expect a clear-cut definition of bisexuality to jump from the pages. We bisexuals tend to define bisexuality in ways that are unique to our own individuality. There are as many definitions of bisexuality as there are bisexuals. Many of us choose not to label ourselves anything at all and find the word bisexual to be inadequate and too limiting. Do not assume that the opinions expressed are shared by all bisexuals, by those actively involved in the bisexual movement, by the magazine staff, or the BABN board of directors. What you can expect is a magazine that, through its inclusive and diverse nature, creates movement away from external and internal limitations and validation. Finding your identity within the LGBTQ community can be confusing, to say the least. When I started to question my own identity in college, I anticipated finding guidance and opportunities for growth. Instead, I wound up exhausted. What began as an exciting journey to self-discovery soon became a downward spiral that resulted in feelings of doubt and a sense that I didn't belong. Through my online research, attending LGBTQ group meetings, and reading queer blogs, I became so overwhelmed with the amount of labels, definitions, and rules that came up with each identity in the LGBTQ community that I ultimately gave up on my self-exploration entirely. I felt like I had to figure out where I fit. Was I bisexual or was I pansexual? Was I asexual and didn't know it? Am I queer enough? Looking back years later, I wish someone had told me that I didn't have to settle on any one identity right away. The path to finding your gender identity or sexuality is not a one-step journey. After years of spending time in online forums, speaking with friends, and reading into the culture of each pocket of our queer community, I found that labels can bring comfort to some individuals on their paths to find themselves. For others, they serve as a concrete roadblock. My best friend, Cal, recently came out to me as a self-identified butch lesbian. A few years before, she had come out to me as a trans man. She describes how, throughout her identity journey, she found labels can act as a springboard rather than a restrictive box. There are all different kinds of people, and there are all different kinds of ways to describe how you identify, she says. In a sense, labels give us language that we really need, but at the same time, it's so open-ended and there really aren't any rules to them, which can be a good and bad thing. Labels can be comforting and easy to latch onto. For many in the LGBTQ community, finding that right fit feels rewarding and welcoming. We're finally able to find our people and continue our journeys alongside them. But the pressure to stay within the parameters of a particular community can also harm one's journey. At some point, adhering to a certain label can become more about pleasing the community than being true to who you really are. While identifying as a trans man, Cal says she encountered all kinds of pressures from within her own community. There are so many ways to be trans, there are so many ways to be a lesbian, there are so many ways to be a gay man, Cal observes, but they're like, you don't look like a trans guy because you wear dresses, or you're not planning on taking hormones, so you're not really trans. Members of subgroups within the LGBTQ community can at times police others who claim and share in that identity. My friend Emily shares how she was called a fake bisexual by members of her local LGBTQ community because she was dating a man. My friend Audrey describes how she internally struggled with identifying as a lesbian and constantly tried to prove herself before ultimately realizing and accepting that she identified as queer. We must allow ourselves the freedom to view labels as checkpoints rather than endpoints. Before identifying as a butch lesbian, Cal also briefly identified as aromantic, which felt right at the time. I'm not saying that's true for every aromantic person, but for me, finding that word helped me make sense of the fact that I can never feel romantic attraction to people, she explains. But I later realized that I was just experiencing compulsive heterosexuality and the fear of being a lesbian, being gay, and all of that. The true key to finding your place within the LGBTQ community is self-reflection and honesty surrounding your feelings and experiences. I hate when people tell others who they are and how they should identify, Cal shares. Don't do that. They'll end up like me, just now realizing that I've been a lesbian for 24 years. Part of that struggle is because people keep telling you that you're something else. It's a different journey for everyone. Ultimately, take the time to be comfortable with who you are on the inside. Don't let a label block your progress. Keep questioning. Our centering hymn is number 181, No Matter If You Live Now Far or Near.
For that.
In 2019, I served as celebrant in a service that our senior minister, Amy Petrie Shaw, offered about gender identity. In place of a sermon, they and I did a Q&A with the congregation. Amy and I fielded questions about our own experiences with gender, questions about trans experiences more broadly, and about other topics circling around queer experience. The questions were often thoughtful, sometimes challenging, and fitting the intent of the service. There were many questions about the words we use. Why do we call ourselves bisexual or pansexual or queer? Who gets to use what words to describe themselves and why? I remember one such question in particular. Someone in the congregation said that for a long time they identified as bisexual, but later their partner came out as non-binary. They didn't know if it was accurate for them to say they were bisexual anymore and wanted to know our thoughts as non-binary people ourselves. Speaking for myself, I answered that I identify as bisexual, as a non-binary person, because it fits. In large part because of other trans and cis people I have known who describe their bisexuality as attraction to people beyond the particulars of gender. Some people might find this definition more expansive than they're used to, but as we heard in our first reading, bisexuals have defined themselves in many and varied ways for decades, and yet still found connection in that single word. This history has played an important role in shaping the words I use to describe myself and why. Over the years, I've found that I use words to describe myself not only because of who I am, but because of who I'm connected to. This value of connection to other people is important to any community built around identity or shared experience, whether you're trans, whether you're queer, or even if you're Unitarian Universalists. While identity labels can clarify our experiences or set us apart from other people, they can also help us realize the deeper connections we have with one another. As you might imagine, the 20 or so minutes we had in that forum weren't enough to dig into these complex questions. However, if you're an LGBTQ person or you spend a lot of time listening to people who are, these questions and debates about terminology may sound familiar to you. We're all on a spectrum, both for sexual orientation and gender identity, as Isabella Gonzalez wrote in our opening words. We all want to belong. We want to connect with people who experience the world like we do when that world often alienates us. Finding words and labels can help us clarify our experiences and understand them in a broader context. In a 2018 article for Slate, Alex Myers wrote that many coming out stories begin with an internal clarity, I felt this way my whole life, mixed with external confusion. I didn't know how to explain it. Resolving when the person meets either an out person who acts as a life model or encounters a term that explains what they have been feeling in language. They help individuals articulate what has previously been an undefined internal state. Whether a word, a person, or a community, encounters like these help people understand that their feelings, attitudes, and behaviors don't exist in isolation. Reading that book on my parents' shelf as a kid, I felt both a sense of clarity about myself as well as a comfort in knowing there were other people in the world with feelings and experiences like mine. These words we use to describe ourselves can help connect us to people with similar experiences across time and space, and they can feel like a refuge. But perhaps in a perverse way, these labels and their assumed meanings can be used to establish and enforce rigid boundaries, separating out who belongs in a group, who doesn't, and why. Later in her article, Isabella Gonzalez alludes to the experiences of alienation from gays and lesbians that some trans, bisexual, and asexual people feel at times. Sometimes it's for not being seen as gay enough or as interlopers in gay community. Some gays and lesbians can perceive these other identities as weakening their political or cultural movements, such as movements for marriage equality or freedom of military service. Or even that, in Myers' words, by advertising an increasing array of identities, the community will appear too on the fringe and become an easy target for mockery from cisgender and heterosexual establishments. When I look for this in my own life, I think of the time as a college sophomore when I heard an alumnus speak about being told by another organizer that he shouldn't talk about his experiences as a trans man because it would detract away from a message pushing for marriage equality. I think of all the times I've heard bisexual and asexual friends talk about feeling and experiencing alienation for not being gay enough or having the assumed ability to pass as straight. Even more narrowly, I've known pansexuals who assume bisexuals are trans-exclusionary because they assume bisexuality can only mean attraction to men or women assumed as such since birth. I've also heard bisexuals accuse pansexuals of recreating the wheel of being attracted to multiple genders. So we're faced with this irony. The tools we look to for our own liberation can just as easily be used to separate us out based on the perceived threats of technicalities, ignoring the common experiences, interests, and oppressions we face as LGBTQ people. I think this boxing out is facilitated in part by an individualistic attitude to identity markers and expression. Many of the narratives I've encountered around identity and labeling prioritize individual interest and experience. I hear this sentence Myers uses to close his article, saying, "Everyone deserves a name." While this is accurate, I also find it cuts the scope of the issue down to personal choice. It ends the sentence before considering the community and connection that exist beyond individuals' needs and experiences. And it's not a narrative I can easily fit over my life's experiences. That book on my parents' shelf, it's so amazing, set me down a path to learn more about myself and other queer people, the names we call ourselves and each other. While it was true at the time that I liked boys, I also had soft feelings for girls. And as a young teen, I understood myself as bisexual. As I grew into young adulthood, I felt that interest in women was more limited, and I found it easier to tell other people I was gay when I first came out. In college, I knew more people with many different genders and sexual orientations, and I felt I could be more nuanced in how I explained myself. I remember calling myself a panromantic gay for a while, which at the time felt like a way I could express the possibility of having romantic feelings for people of any gender, while at the core of it, just being another guy who was mostly interested in other guys. I later came to know myself as non-binary and transgender and not really much of a guy at all. I clarified then that I was pansexual, but later fell away from feeling represented by that word. On one level, I felt disconnected from how I heard other pansexuals I knew describe their experience as being interested in personalities rather than genders. And I found that has never really been true for me. But I really came back home to calling myself bisexual because of the other bisexuals I've known in my life. I think of my friend April, a non-binary person who talked often about their experiences in bi-activist groups in Minneapolis. Our first reading, which since its publication has sometimes been called the Bisexual Manifesto, has also been incredibly important to me. I take a lot of comfort and guidance knowing that even 30 years ago, bisexuals were pushing back against preconceived notions of who we are and how we feel. Even when we're making room for the wide variety of personal experiences we can have, still choosing to call ourselves by the same name, still recognizing that the similarities connecting us are stronger bonds than the difference that set us apart. This is why I say I'm bisexual, not just because of who I am or how I feel, but in recognition of who I'm connected to across time and space. All of this is to say I may deserve to have a name, but which one? I've called myself by so many names and eventually come back around to the first word I use to understand myself. I can't make sense of this journey as someone making the decisions of an isolated individual. I've had a similar experience as a Unitarian Universalist, and maybe some of you have as well. My own practices and worldviews have been shaped by paganism, Catholicism, Buddhism, and others. I participate in Unitarian Universalist community where I can cherish and uplift all of those influences without feeling pressure to sideline or suppress any of them. I am a Unitarian Universalist because I value being connected in community to people with a broad range of spiritual and ethical traditions. The richness that comes from that connection is why I'm here. We are not Unitarian Universalists because of one thing we believe or one way we practice or one source we honor. We are Unitarian Universalists because of the common vision we have for our lives and the world, and for the connections we have with one another. We recognize that the similarities connecting us are stronger bonds than the differences that set us apart. So in closing, I ask you this. I ask you to consider not just who you are, but who you're connected to. Whose space and values and experiences do you share, even in spite of your differences? How are your lives richer because of these connections? While words can get in between us, the visions and the values we share in common can see us through.
Melting, burning, changing together in this hour we share together. Let the light of this chalice, though we extinguish it now, guide us to be together with one another in our wider lives. Our closing hymn is number 130, O Liberating Rose.
The insight of our true nature emerges from the gentle yet persistent exploration of the questions, who am I and who are we, in this current life experience. And there is nothing outside of this exploration, including our sexualities, our gender identities, and our orientations. The path towards freedom is not going around the experience of identity or transcending the experience of identity, but going through the experience of identity, however that manifests for us. This service has ended, and our service in the wider world continues. May we go forth in peace and love. Ashe, amen, and may it be so.
He has a religion which, like sunshine, goes everywhere. It's temple of space, it's shrine of good heart, it's creed of truth, it's spiritual works of love. Thank you.